The opulence of the grand hotel ballroom was overwhelming. Chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 tiny suns, reflecting the wealth and status of everyone in attendance. The tables were adorned with crisp white linens, golden cutlery, and floral centerpieces so extravagant they could rival the gardens of Versailles. It was a world far removed from Sophie Delgado's simple life, and yet, here she was, standing beside Nicholas Warren, the enigmatic billionaire who had plucked her from his staff quarters just hours earlier. "Don't overthink it, Sophie," Nicholas had said in his usual casual, yet commanding tone. "You'll do great." His words played on repeat in her mind as they walked into the room together. Sophie, dressed in an elegant emerald green gown borrowed from the boutique staff at Nicholas's request, felt the weight of 100 gazes. Guests murmured, their eyes bouncing from Nicholas, one of the most eligible bachelors in the country, to the unfamiliar woman by his side. She had only been his maid for 2 months, cleaning his sprawling mansion, ironing his crisp white shirts, and organizing his towering shelves of leather-bound books. Their interactions were brief but always courteous. She had no idea why he had chosen her to accompany him to this exclusive business dinner, nor had he offered an explanation. But as Nicholas led her to their table, Sophie began to piece things together. Whispers floated across the room. "Who is she? Is she his new girlfriend? She doesn't seem like the type." Despite the tension in the air, Nicholas seemed unbothered. He leaned down and whispered, "You're doing fine. Just be yourself." Be herself? Sophie nearly laughed. How could she be herself when she didn't even belong here? Yet something in his tone reassured her, and she took a deep breath, forcing a smile. As the dinner progressed, Nicholas became the center of attention, his sharp wit and charm captivating everyone at the table. Sophie remained quiet, absorbing the conversations, occasionally nodding politely. She noticed the disapproving glances from some of the women and the thinly veiled curiosity from the men. Then, dessert was served. That's when the night took an unexpected turn. The host of the evening, Charles Worthington, a sharp-eyed industrialist, stood and raised his glass for a toast. "To Nicholas Warren, our visionary partner. His groundbreaking acquisition will undoubtedly reshape the industry and cement his legacy as one of the greats." Applause erupted around the table, but Sophie noticed a flicker of discomfort on Nicholas's face. He didn't lift his glass. "Come now, Nicholas," Charles said, his tone teasing but firm. "Don't be modest. Share a few words about your remarkable success." All eyes turned to Nicholas. He hesitated for the first time that evening, glancing briefly at Sophie. And then Sophie did something that left everyone, including Nicholas, in stunned silence. She stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "If I may, I'd like to share a little about Nicholas Warren, because I believe there's something important everyone should know about the man you're applauding tonight." The room grew deathly quiet. Nicholas's brows furrowed in surprise, his hand half raised as if to stop her. Sophie met his gaze briefly, her own expression unreadable, before continuing. "Nicholas Warren is indeed a man of vision, but what makes him truly remarkable isn't his wealth or his success. It's his heart. When I first started working for him, I saw not just a man consumed by ambition, but one who cared deeply for others, even those who most people would overlook." She paused, her voice faltering slightly as emotion crept in. "I know, because I'm one of those people. And I wouldn't be standing here tonight if not for his kindness. You see, just 2 months ago, I was..." She took a deep breath, her words hanging in the air. The room seemed to collectively lean in, waiting for the revelation. "Homeless." Gasps rippled through the room. Nicholas stiffened, his face a mixture of shock and something else, something softer, more vulnerable. Sophie glanced down at him, her lips trembling into a small smile. "Nicholas didn't just give me a job. He gave me hope. And that, I believe, is worth far more than any business deal." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, One person began to clap, followed by another, until the entire room was filled with applause. Nicholas stood, his eyes locking with Sophie's. "I think we've heard enough speeches for one night," he said with a small smile, guiding her back to her seat. But as the applause continued, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something deeper was at play, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead. The applause echoed long after the room settled back into polite conversation. Sophie sat quietly, her heart pounding. What had possessed her to stand up like that? She'd broken every unspoken rule of a night like this, and yet, Nicholas hadn't looked angry. His calm response was far more unsettling. When the dinner concluded, Nicholas offered Sophie his arm, guiding her through the crowd of guests who now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. As they reached the hotel's grand foyer, he finally broke the silence. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone light but edged with something Sophie couldn't quite place. She stopped walking, forcing him to face her. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you." You didn't." His interruption was firm, but not unkind. "You surprised me, yes, but I wasn't embarrassed." Sophie searched his expression for clues, but as always, his face was unreadable. "Why did you bring me tonight, Nicholas?" "I need to know the truth." He hesitated, then sighed. "Not here." Before she could protest, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Nicholas opened the door for her, and she climbed in, her mind racing. The car ride back to his estate was silent, the air heavy with unspoken words. Once they arrived, Nicholas led her into his expansive library, a room Sophie had cleaned countless times but never truly entered. The walls were lined with books that seemed to stretch endlessly, the scent of aged leather and mahogany filling the air. He gestured for her to sit on one of the plush armchairs near the fireplace, then poured 2 glasses of brandy. "Nicholas, Sophie started, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I owe you an explanation," he said, handing her a glass before taking a seat across from her. "I didn't bring you tonight on a whim. I had my reasons." Sophie's fingers tightened around the glass. "Then tell me." He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. "You probably noticed Charles Worthington tonight. He's one of my most influential business partners, and also one of the most ruthless. For months, he's been pushing me into a merger that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Tonight's dinner was his way of solidifying the deal, of showing everyone that it's a foregone conclusion." "What does that have to do with me?" Sophie asked, genuinely baffled. Nicholas met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability. "I needed someone who wasn't part of that world. Someone authentic. You reminded me of what really matters, of the reasons I started all this in the first place. I thought, maybe they'd see it too." His admission left her speechless. Sophie had spent years feeling invisible, her life reduced to survival. To hear that she had made such an impact on someone like Nicholas was overwhelming. "But then you stood up," he continued, his lips curving into a small smile. "And you did more than I ever could have. You reminded everyone in that room that there's more to life than power and money. You reminded me." Her cheeks flushed, but she wasn't entirely convinced. "So, this was all just strategy?" Nicholas shook his head. "No. If it were, I'd have hired someone to play the role. I brought you because I trust you, Sophie. You've shown me nothing but honesty since the day we met. That's rare in my world." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sophie wasn't sure how to respond, so she said the first thing that came to mind. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone." A shadow crossed his face. "I'm used to being alone." Before Sophie could reply, the library door creaked open, and Margaret, Nicholas's longtime assistant, stepped in. Her expression was grave. "Sir, we need to talk." Nicholas stood, his demeanor shifting instantly into the composed businessman Sophie recognized. "What is it?" Margaret glanced at Sophie, then back at Nicholas. It's about the Worthington merger. I just received a call. There's something you need to see. Nicholas exchanged a look with Margaret, then turned back to Sophie. Wait here. I'll be back shortly. As they left the room, Sophie felt a knot of unease settle in her stomach. Something about the urgency in Margaret's voice didn't sit right. She waited for what felt like an eternity, the fire crackling softly in the background. Unable to sit still any longer, she wandered over to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of the books. Her gaze landed on a small leather-bound journal tucked away behind a row of larger volumes. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled it out, flipping it open. The entries were written in Nicholas's handwriting, each one revealing pieces of a man she realized she barely knew. One entry caught her eye. I've worked so hard to build this empire, but at what cost? The people I trust are few, and the betrayals are many. If I'm not careful, I'll lose more than just my company, I'll lose myself. The sound of footsteps snapped her out of her thoughts. She quickly returned the journal to its place just as Nicholas re-entered the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. What's wrong? Sophie asked, her concern genuine. He hesitated, then spoke. It seems tonight's dinner was more than a celebration. Charles has been hiding something that could ruin everything I've built. Sophie's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Nicholas's jaw tightened. I mean, we're not just fighting for a deal anymore. We're fighting for survival. And with those words, Sophie knew their lives were about to change forever. Nicholas's words lingered in the air, heavy with foreboding. Sophie watched him pace the room, his calm exterior beginning to crack under the weight of whatever Margaret had revealed to him. I don't understand, Sophie said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. What could Charles be hiding that's so dangerous? Nicholas paused, his sharp gaze meeting hers. Charles and I have a history. Years ago, when I was just starting out, he helped fund my first major venture. But his help came with strings attached, ones I didn't see until it was too late. Now, he's trying to use those strings to pull me into a merger that will give him control over everything I've built. Sophie furrowed her brow. But why now? What's changed? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Margaret found out that Charles has been leaking confidential information about my company to the media. Financial data, internal strategies, things that could destroy my reputation if they go public. Her stomach twisted. So he's blackmailing you? In a way, yes, Nicholas admitted. If I don't agree to the merger, he'll release the information and ruin me. If I do agree, I'll lose control of my company, and likely much more in the long run. Sophie stood, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her determined expression. You can't let him do this to you. There has to be a way to fight back. Nicholas gave a bitter laugh. You make it sound so simple. But in my world, battles like these aren't fought with honesty or good intentions. They're fought with leverage. Sophie's mind raced. She didn't know much about the world of high-stakes business, but she did know people. And Charles Worthington, from what she'd seen tonight, was a man driven by greed and ego. If Nicholas could find a way to expose his true motives, perhaps the tables could turn. I want to help, she said firmly. Nicholas looked at her, surprised. You've already helped more than you realize, Sophie. But this isn't your fight. It is now, she countered. You said you trust me. Let me prove that you were right to. For a moment, he simply stared at her, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart. No one can know what we're planning, not even Margaret. Charles has ears everywhere. Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a game to Nicholas, it was a battle for his future. The next morning, Sophie woke with a renewed sense of purpose. Nicholas had spent hours briefing her on the details of the merger and Charles's underhanded tactics. He'd also given her a mission: to gather information from the one person Charles trusted implicitly, his wife, Evelyn Worthington. Evelyn was known for her elegance and sharp wit, but Sophie had caught a glimpse of something else last night, a woman who seemed tired, perhaps even disillusioned with the world her husband had built. If anyone could provide the leverage Nicholas needed, it was her. Nicholas arranged for Sophie to run into Evelyn at a high-end boutique later that afternoon. Wearing a simple yet stylish outfit Nicholas had provided, Sophie felt like an imposter stepping into the world of luxury and privilege. But she reminded herself that she wasn't just doing this for Nicholas, she was doing it for the man she'd come to respect deeply, a man who deserved better than the fate Charles had planned for him. When Sophie spotted Evelyn browsing a display of designer handbags, she took a deep breath and approached her. "Mrs. Worthington," she said, her voice warm and unassuming. Evelyn turned, her perfectly arched brows lifting in surprise. "Yes?" "I hope I'm not intruding," Sophie said with a polite smile. "We met briefly last night at the dinner. I was with Nicholas Warren." Recognition flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Yes." The maid turned mystery date. Sophie's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I suppose that's one way to describe me." Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. "And what brings you here today?" "Surely not handbags." Sophie decided to take a chance. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you. Privately." Evelyn's smile faltered. "That's quite forward of you, isn't it?" "Maybe," Sophie admitted. "But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. It's about your husband and the merger." Evelyn's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. After a moment, she nodded. "Follow me." She led Sophie to a small cafe nearby, where they settled into a secluded corner. Evelyn studied Sophie with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. "All right," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Talk." Sophie took a deep breath. "I know Charles has been pressuring Nicholas into this merger. And I know it's not about business, it's about control." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "And why would you care about any of this?" "Because Nicholas deserves better," Sophie said simply. "And I think, deep down, you know that." Evelyn's posture stiffened, but she didn't interrupt. "I saw you last night," Sophie continued. "You seemed unhappy. Like someone who's been playing a part for too long. I think you know what kind of man Charles is. And I think you know that this merger isn't as clean as he's making it seem." Evelyn's gaze dropped to her hands, her polished facade cracking ever so slightly. "You're very perceptive," she murmured. "Then help us," Sophie urged. "Help Nicholas expose the truth." Evelyn looked up, her eyes shimmering with something Sophie couldn't quite identify: pain, regret, perhaps even hope. After a long pause, she leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "There's something you need to see," she said. "But if I show you, you have to promise me one thing." "What?" Sophie asked, her heart pounding. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Promise me Nicholas won't let Charles win." Sophie nodded, her resolve hardening. "I promise." And as Evelyn began to speak, Sophie realized they were uncovering a secret far bigger than anything she'd imagined. Evelyn's revelations unraveled like the plot of a thriller, each word pulling Sophie deeper into a web of deceit. Charles Worthington wasn't merely pressuring Nicholas into a merger, he was orchestrating a hostile takeover. And worse, he was doing it using illegal insider deals that tied back to several of Nicholas's most trusted associates. "The documents are in Charles's private study," Evelyn said, her voice trembling as she handed Sophie a set of keys. "The second drawer in his desk. He's paranoid, so it's always locked, but these will get you in." Sophie's heart raced. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn's gaze turned somber. Because I'm tired of being complicit. I've watched Charles destroy lives for years, and I stayed silent. But Nicholas, he's different. He doesn't belong in this world of lies and betrayal. He deserves a fighting chance. Sophie nodded, determination surging through her. I'll get the documents to Nicholas. He'll know what to do. Evelyn reached out, squeezing Sophie's hand. Be careful. If Charles catches wind of this, she didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear. Later that night, Sophie and Nicholas sat in his study, the stolen documents spread across the desk between them. Nicholas's face was a mixture of disbelief and fury as he scanned the papers, each one more damning than the last. This is everything, he said finally, his voice low and tense. Proof of insider trading, fraudulent accounts. Charles will be ruined if this goes public. But will it save your company? Sophie asked, her voice tinged with worry. Nicholas leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. It's not just about saving the company. It's about taking a stand, for once, not letting someone like Charles get away with this. His words resonated deeply with Sophie. She had spent so much of her life being overlooked, underestimated. Standing up for what was right felt like the only path forward, for both of them. What's the plan? She asked, her eyes locking with his. Nicholas's lips curved into a small, determined smile. We go public. But not before we ensure Charles can't retaliate. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Nicholas called in a trusted legal team to prepare the documents for submission to the authorities. Evelyn, true to her word, provided additional evidence that painted a damning picture of her husband's schemes. Sophie worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing files, arranging meetings, and keeping a close eye on any signs of Charles catching wind of their plan. As the clock ticked down to the morning of the press conference, tension filled the air. Sophie could see it in Nicholas's posture, the way his shoulders tightened every time his phone buzzed. You're taking a big risk, she said quietly as they stood in his office, waiting for the final confirmation from his legal team. Nicholas turned to her, his expression softening. The only thing riskier would be doing nothing. If I let Charles win, I lose more than my company, I lose who I am. Sophie nodded, her chest tightening with pride and something deeper she couldn't quite name. The press conference was held in the same grand hotel where Sophie had first accompanied Nicholas. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched him step onto the stage, his presence commanding even in the face of what was sure to be a media storm. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady and clear. Today, I'm here to address a matter of great importance, not just to my company, but to the integrity of the business world as a whole. He went on to outline the evidence against Charles Worthington, carefully avoiding implicating Evelyn. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered furiously into their phones, and the room seemed to pulse with the weight of the revelations. By the time he finished, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't just the applause that struck Sophie, it was the way Nicholas held his head high, unflinching in the face of adversity. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the press conference was swift and severe. Charles Worthington faced multiple investigations, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own greed. Evelyn, who had filed for divorce shortly after the press conference, began rebuilding her life away from the shadow of her husband's misdeeds. As for Nicholas, his decision to go public earned him both praise and criticism. Some questioned his judgment, while others hailed him as a man of integrity in a world that often lacked it. Through it all, Sophie remained by his side. She had become more than just a maid or an assistant, she was his confidant, his anchor in the storm. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Nicholas broke the comfortable silence between them. You saved me, Sophie, he said softly, his gaze fixed on hers. She smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. I think you saved yourself, Nicholas. I just reminded you of who you are. He reached across the small table between them, taking her hand in his. You did more than that. You changed my life. and I don't want to imagine it without you in it." Sophie's breath caught. In his eyes, she saw not the billionaire or the businessman, but a man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. And for the first time in years, they both felt something they hadn't dared to hope for, a future filled with possibility, built not on wealth or power, but on trust, courage, and love. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and enjoy these other amazing stories.